Radiant Historia is a time-traveling RPG for the Nintendo DS. It was released in North America in 2011 to highly positive reviews and fan reception. However, the game went fairly unnoticed by the larger gaming community, only gaining attention from hardcore JRPG fans, and there are good reasons for this. For one, the Nintendo DS was on its last legs in 2011, and the launch of the Nintendo 3DS was on the horizon. Many DS fans were looking ahead to the 3DS or spending more time on their consoles or PCs. Also, 2011 was an incredible year for gaming, with tons of AAA titles. Games like Mass Effect 2, Little Big Planet 2, and Pokemon Black and White all came out around the same time as Radiant Historia's release. The rest of the year saw juggernauts like Skyrim, Battlefield 3, and Skyward Sword, and with the overwhelming number of game releases in 2011, and many games that would grab the attention of JRPG fans, it's easy to see why Radiant Historia would get buried. Fast forward to 2018, and I am ecstatic to see a remake being released. Radiant Historia: Perfect Chronology. It features a new timeline, more difficulty options, a new character, and updated graphics. However, it's not hard to draw comparisons with 2011. The Nintendo 3DS is undoubtedly on its last legs, with the Nintendo Switch getting the bulk of the attention from gaming media, Nintendo, and gamers themselves. And with many AAA games already released or coming soon, it's quite possible we see a repeat of 2011. This is why I am making this video. Radiant Historia is one of the best JRPGs released in the last 10 years, and you should absolutely pick it up this time around. The plot is easily the greatest appeal of Radiant Historia. It's a time travel story, one in which the protagonist Stock attempts to find the true history among an overwhelming number of timelines that lead to ruin. The game takes place on the continent of Vancouver, which is dominated by two warring nations, Alistel and Grenoric. The nations are fighting over land, as the world of Vancouver is suffering from a severe desertification. The appeal of this premise is that it's not about conquest, power, or dominance. It's about these nations' very existence. The desertification is reducing the amount of usable land at a rapid pace, which would hinder the nation's agriculture and ultimately lead to their demise. You can feel the anxiety within the people of Alistel and Grenoric. They are terrified of the desertification and its implications. It's about their nation's survival or the others, an us versus them mentality. The world of Radiant Historia evolves throughout the game. Alistel and Grenoric are not the only societies at play. There are several other groups such as the Neutral Kingdom of Cygnus, the Satyros' Forest of Celestia, and the Guttrell's Nation of Forgia. Each of these parties, in addition to Alistel and Grenoric, have their own motivations, aspirations, and societal beliefs. The politics of these nations is dynamic. There are tons of changing alliances, backstabbing, oppressive regimes, and religious undertones. There is no good or evil in the world of Vancouver, just different sides fighting for survival in a world that cannot possibly support all of them. The beauty of this is that the plot, despite its complexity, is incredibly easy to follow. At no point will you be confused about what is going on because the game does incredibly well in explaining its concepts and the events that are occurring. There is a lot going on in this game, and as a result, there is a lot of dialogue. But at no point does any of it feel unnecessary. There are no moments that are only there to extend the length of the game. It's well paced. The plot picks up right at the beginning of the game, with major events happening in the very first hour. But at the same time, the world building doesn't suffer because of this. Many games take several hours for their plots to pick up because they focus on building their world before advancing their narrative. And while this is a valid form of storytelling, Radiant Historia does it better. The world building is interwoven with its fast-paced narrative. The player learns about Vancouver as they follow Stock's journey. The narrative keeps you engaged from the get-go and enhances the player's overall experience. For this next segment, I will be talking about the events of the first hour or so of Radiant Historia. If you are sensitive to spoilers, I would suggest moving on to the designated timestamp. The game begins with Stock, a highly talented agent in Alistel's Special Intelligence Division. Stock receives a mission from his superior Hees, which is to recover an agent with information on Grenoric's armament. After detailing the mission, Hees gives Stock a mysterious book known as the White Chronicle, and states that it might be useful in the mission. Stock then goes to meet two subordinates that were assigned to him for the mission, Rainey and Marco. After discussing the mission with them, he has a vision of them laying dead in a field right before his very eyes. During the mission itself, things quickly go wrong. The Grenoric army received intel on their mission, and the group gets ambushed by Palamedes the Executioner, a high-ranking soldier in Grenoric's army. Upon seeing the helplessness of the situation, Rainey and Marco buy time for Stock and ultimately die at the hands of Palamedes. Stock eventually loses consciousness and wakes up in a place called Historia. This is where he meets two children, Tio and Lipti, who acknowledge Stock as the wielder of the White Chronicle. They tell him that his decisions during the mission ultimately led to his friend's death, but that he can use the White Chronicle to go back in time and undo the situation. Stock then uses the White Chronicle to return to the battlefield and instruct Marco and Rainey to go through a different path, which prevents their death. These events serve as a catalyst for the rest of the game, as Stock navigates his way through different timelines in an attempt to find a chain of decisions that resolve the political conflicts and end the desertification. The White Chronicle, however, is not all-powerful. It can only jump back to especially important events in the time called nodes, and there are moments where Stock's mistakes cannot be undone. This is compounded by the fact that Stock sustains any injuries that he experienced in a different timeline, since from his perspective, the events still happen. And should he die in a timeline, it's permanent. There is no going back. This raises the stakes of the narrative since Stock's mistakes still hold weight, and it leaves open the possibility that he fails entirely. I will never forget Radiant Historia's incredible plot. The game evokes a sense of sadness when the characters are suffering, and it will make you smile when the characters are doing well. You will definitely be invested in this game's plot and all of its twists and turns. Stock is one of my favorite video game characters. He's a subversion of the typical JRPG protagonist, the shy hero of justice with unrealistic expectations and ideologies. Instead, Stock is calm and collected. He can effectively analyze the situation and determine a strong course of action. He is a man of few words, and tends to be on the serious side, but this is not in an edgy way. He's nothing like other serious characters like Squall from Final Fantasy VIII. In fact, he is an extremely compassionate man. He cares deeply for the people around him, but he simply expresses it through his actions as opposed to giving speeches of friendship. Stock is also a very grounded and realistic character. He would never charge into a situation blindly without a plan, and if it's unrealistic to fight the enemy head-on, he can acknowledge this and flee or resort to stealth and espionage. This was a refreshing characteristic because I honestly find that a lot of JRPG protagonists charge into the battlefield against impossible odds. Stock is also a character that has a good read on the situation that he is in. Unlike most JRPG protagonists, he is not oblivious to his surroundings. He is actively questioning the nature of his tasks, the intentions of others, and whether it's even possible to end a desertification. He even predicts some of the future events of the game, but this is not in a way that spoils the game. The events that he predicts are ones that most players can rationalize on their own, and he certainly doesn't predict the bigger plot twists of the game. I know that I'm not the only one who feels frustrated when a protagonist is completely oblivious to everything around them, so Stock's ability to understand a situation was a welcome character trait. Despite his myriad of good qualities, Stock is by no means a Gary Stu. His quiet nature can lead to a lack of communication and understanding from other characters. This leads to frustration to those around him, and hinders his group's ability to accomplish their goals. It even occasionally leads to full-scale conflicts. He also makes plenty of mistakes throughout the game, some of which have very real and permanent consequences, even with the time travel mechanic, and as a result, Stock is a complete character, with tons of interesting traits that are uncommon in the genre, while also having clear and definite flaws. Rosh is Stock's best friend and leader of the Rosh Brigade in Alistel. He is an extremely loyal and dedicated individual, fully devoted to Alistel's army. He cares deeply for every single member of his brigade and really wants the absolute best for Alistel and all of his friends and family. But there's more to him than just that. Rosh's ideals are constantly brought into question throughout the game as he faces the harsh realities of the war and the desertification. His character arc centers around him finding a balance between his idealism and reality, and it was fascinating to see how his character developed. Rainey and Marco are soldiers who were assigned as Stock's subordinates by Heese at the beginning of the game. They initially see Stock as a colleague, but quickly become fond of who he is as a person. Throughout the game, they demonstrate a deeply rooted devotion to Stock and trust in his judgment. They believe in his cause, despite not knowing of the White Chronicle. Their devotion can be thought of in a similar manner to Roronoa Zoro's loyalty to Monkey D. Luffy. Rainy can be fairly outspoken and is reasonably developed. However, Marco suffers from being the worst written character in the game. He certainly isn't a bad character by any means, but he fades into the background and the player never really gets an idea of who he really is. Ott is a young girl who is a part of the Satiros race and hails from the forest of Celestia. She's a shaman, an individual who is charged with sending souls to heaven. Shaman are viewed very highly in Satiros society, and as a result, Ott plays a pivotal role in Celestia's politics. In addition, she really looks up to Stock like an older brother, and their relationship is adorable. It works because it's not creepy in the slightest. Gafka is a guttural, which is a tribe of beast kind. The tribe have magnificent combat ability, but are actually pacifists. In the past, they were used and manipulated by humans as tools for war, and as a result, they have a strong collective hatred for all humans, to the point where the ones who do not hate humanity are banished. Gafka is one of the banished, and his character arc revolves around improving his relationship with his tribe to help Stock and his friends, but also to help his people better cope with the atrocities they faced in the past. And finally, there is this woman here. I'm not going to provide any information about her character because I find it best if you go into the game not knowing anything about her. But I would like to mention that she is definitely one of my favorites and makes Radiant Historia what it is. While I will always maintain that the story and characters are the main draw of Radiant Historia, the combat is still very fun. It's a traditional turn order battle system similar to Final Fantasy X, but with an interesting twist. The enemies are placed on a 3x3 grid, and they can be moved across the grid with specific skills. For example, if one enemy is in front of the other, you can use a push assault with Stock to put multiple enemies in the same square, and then use fire with Rainy to attack both of them. And as you progress through the game, there are more layers added to this. Ott is able to set traps, which deals devastating damage when an enemy lands on it. The game also has a launch mechanic, which sends the enemy into the air, allowing your characters to deal bonus damage. And finally, there are plenty of area of effect spells and skills to make the combat feel fun and exciting. Also, the characters all feel unique, and while some are certainly better in combat than others, all of them are definitely effective enough to beat the game without any issues, and you compound this with quick transitions and relatively fast animations and you have a very competent turn-based battle system. Radiant Historia's soundtrack is brilliantly composed by the talented Yoko Shimomura, known for her works on series like Kingdom Hearts, Street Fighter, and even the incredible Xenoblade Chronicles. Every single track is a hit. It captures the mood of a scene, the culture of a town, or the rush of a battle. If you're still on the fence about this game, I would highly recommend listening to some of the tracks. My personal favorites include An Earnest Desire of Grey, Memories of the World, and Mechanical Kingdom, but I'd recommend listening to as many as you can because they are all beautifully done. Like all games, Radiant Historia has some flaws, and I do believe that it is important to address them. The first is more of a point of contention than a flaw, which is the linear nature of the game. Radiant Historia features two major timelines and a myriad of bad endings where Stock makes an incorrect choice. In both of the major timelines, Stock frequently runs into situations where he cannot advance, which requires him to jump to the other timeline to learn a skill and then jump back and continue. As a result, every player will experience the same events in the game, albeit in slightly different orders. I personally enjoyed the linearity in Radiant Historia because it allowed me to see what the writers intended with the creative freedom they were given. However, I do understand why some people would want a more non-linear tale with branching paths. The second flaw has to do with the plot. Radiant Historia does a pretty good job at tying up loose plot threads, but with the nature of a time travel story, it's extremely difficult to have no plot holes. Radiant Historia certainly has a few, and while I cannot go into detail about these plot holes because of spoilers, it's important to note that they certainly do exist. Next is the graphics and art style. While perfect Chronology graphics are acceptable by 3DS standards, It will be difficult for those who are used to gaming on PC, PS4, or even the Switch to adjust to the 3DS's 240p. As for the art style, the original game had beautiful hand-drawn characters and a very unique look. Perfect Chronology forgoes this for a more standard design. I'm only speaking anecdotally here, but I prefer the art style of the original game, and I have seen many fans express the same sentiment. Finally, the amount of added content is relatively minor. Perfect Chronology adds a hard mode, a welcome addition as it addresses the easy difficulty of the base game. The game also adds a new character named Nemasia, who further explains the world's history. With Nemasia, Stock explores a third timeline known as the Sub-History, where he explores various scenarios that resulted from a ripple effect of his actions. The Japanese fanbase have described the Sub-History as hit or miss. Some of the events add to the plot, whereas others feel like filler. I can't fully form my opinion of the Sub-History until I get my hands on Perfect Chronology myself, but this is something to keep in mind. Regardless, I would like to emphasize that the base game is already very complete, with a fully fleshed out plot and battle system. Despite a few flaws, Radiant Historia stands above many modern JRPGs and should be held in high regard. The battle system is innovative and fun, the characters are fascinating, and the world is complex and evolving, but it's the game's plot that stands above the rest, a tale that will keep you at the edge of your seat. It's an emotional story, one that has brought many players to tears upon its conclusion. It's a story that will forever be etched into your memory, and it's for this reason that Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology is worth your money.